Welcome to the return of the Establish the Edge podcast. Took a few months off post NFL season to unwind a little bit, work on some off-season analysis, but excited to get back at it. So thanks for tuning in on the podcast or the Establish the Edge YouTube channel. I've got Anthony Amico with me. We'll be doing some Dynasty content over the next month or so. And Amico, let's dive right into it. Today's episode is going to be about who you should take first overall in your Superflex rookie drafts. Is it Caleb Williams or is it Marvin Harrison Jr.? That's what we're going to look at today. And while we do that, we'll talk a little bit about quarterback value in general and how it ages really well in Superflex leagues. So, Amico, start with you. 101, you're on the clock. Marvin Harrison Jr. or Caleb Williams?
It's Caleb, dude. I mean, how many people are clicking into the show being like, all right, let's hear Leone's contrarian take about the first pick. But yeah, I'm taking Caleb. I mean, I just think that he is one of the best quarterback prospects we've seen. I know that I feel like we maybe say that too often, but I think in the case of Caleb, it's probably somewhat true. And I think perhaps even more important than his profile just as a prospect in a vacuum, I think that Chicago has one of the best setups for a rookie quarterback that we've seen. I mean, maybe ever. Just if in the time I've been playing Dynasty Fantasy Football, like I mean, Burrows was obviously very good also, but I just feel like the Bears have really created a great environment here, and that really reduces some of the risk for me that you get with a lot of these quarterbacks. So I think you have the high ceiling without maybe as low as a floor as we got from a guy like Bryce last year.
Yeah, I do agree on the floor thing. It's hard to see him completely flopping, and as I'll get into, it kind of takes a complete flop to really totally lose out on quarterback value. The idea for this show came to me when I was just, I'm listening to podcasts, consuming content, and Marvin Harrison Jr. and to an extent Malik Neighbors are just such high-end wide receiver prospects. And we're talking like in the Amari Cooper, Jamar Chase type mold as prospects. And I'm in a couple leagues where I'm in a rebuild and I've got the 101 and I'm kind of like, I'm not going to compete right away. I feel like to the extent that you can feel really good about any of these things because they're so, unpredictable, but I feel like the hit rate on like a Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors type is quite high, maybe like 80+%. Maybe I'm overconfident in that, but I feel like it's much higher than like almost any asset you get when you get a wide receiver prospect of this nature. And I'm thinking to myself, 4 years from now, I can have like a near lock in Marvin Harrison, like a great store of value. It's very low risk while having high reward. Whereas if you look at the quarterback position, you can ask anyone who evaluates, a lot of time these top picks, like from a real life perspective, like they're kind of 50-50, even the best ones. Like it's very difficult. So that was sort of the impetus for me to, get you on and talk about this a little bit more. I did write an article for our site to kind of parse through this. And it's tough because the sample sizes on past rookie drafts are small, but I basically took the rookie draft from 2020 to 2023, the last four, to have a sample size that was like okay, but like still relevant. Like those guys from 2020 still hold a lot of value. And I just looked at where guys were taken at what position and what their current market trade value is. And you can use the Establish the Run Dynasty Trade Calculator. I used 100% market value because I know like we love wide receivers, like don't like running backs. And I ended up comparing all the positions. I didn't want like our bias in it. But one of the things that kept me kind of on the Caleb train was almost not even like the upside of quarterbacks. Is like you've told me when they hit in a huge way. But even just like some of these guys, like we pull up like Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young, and Fields, I feel like are the three I want to look at most because and on the right side of the trade calculator, I'll put in like an early first of next season. So you kind of have a comparison. And basically my idea was like a boom pick is like a pick that you've made where the market value is still higher than an early first. Anthony Richardson's worth like 2 early firsts right now by the market, and he's played like 3.5 games. So like just the promise of those 3.5 games and then missing the rest of the season has him worth 2 early firsts. So like that's a huge win for the quarterback position. You look at Bryce Young, he's worth like 2/3 of an early first. He's kind of worth like a generic future first right now, and had about as bad of a year as possible. I know for me personally, like I flipped him in the 203 for Tyreek Hill. Then even Justin Fields, who's not going into the season as a starter. We don't know when or how much he'll start again. You can like I've gotten 2 second-round pick offers for him, which is not good. Don't get me wrong, but this is a guy who's kind of like a clear bust 4 years into his career, and you're still getting so like this floor is like kind of insane in addition to the ceiling stuff you pointed out to me.
Yeah, I it's just such an important position, you know. Like I think that the biggest thing that I relearn every year in these dynasty leagues is like there is just no worse feeling than not having a quarterback. So a guy like Bryce, who wasn't good last year in reality or fantasy, we're still not really sure how good he's going to be. Like just by the fact that I know I can put him in my lineup and get points at that position, just has so much value. And you always end up, I feel like, with a guy in your league. Like I know that we do stuff where trading isn't always allowed, but like these leagues where maybe there's like a trade deadline, there is always a point during the year, I feel like, where a team is like, oh my gosh, like I need a quarterback so bad. And you get appropriate or maybe even better value than you expect.
Yeah, and looking at quarterbacks that have gone in the early first of dynasty drafts, Superflex drafts, the last 4 years, Burrow in 2020. In 2021, you had Lawrence, Fields, and Lance. We didn't have one in 2022. And then 2023, Stroud, Richardson, and Bryce Young. Like Stroud, Richardson, Burrow, and Lawrence are all like smashes. And like Lawrence really hasn't even hit in a hard way, but he's just like good enough from a fantasy perspective. I think he's pretty undervalued in real life right now by a lot of fans, but like he's good enough and has like a stranglehold on the job. And like that alone makes him a huge win. So the receiver side is harder to find comparisons to, because like part of my argument for Marvin Harrison Jr., even though I'm capitulating, I'm with you, like Caleb's the 101, there's just less to compare to, because if you look at wide receiver, even like first round stuff, it is kind of volatile. The hits are really quite big. Like when you hit like 2020, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson are like still 4 years later, massive wins. Like we're talking like top 15 dynasty assets. You do have a lot of players, even the last couple of years, that really didn't hit well early, and they more so like when you get in like middle first, like when those guys have a bad year, they're kind of like done, you know, the Sky Moores of the world. But even like Traylon Burks, you know, we're 2 years out and he's worth almost nothing, you know. There's not really, the only QB that's really busted is Trey Lance. And even with him, you've had outs. Like even up until last year, you had outs with Trey Lance. Which is kind of crazy. But I went on a tangent. But my point with the receiver stuff is hard to find a comparison, just because I don't think there's been wide receivers of Harrison and Neighbors' level. Do you agree with that? Or like, how do you view them in the lens of like the receiver prospects we've had the last handful of years?
Yeah, I agree with that for Harrison. I mean, I think that there's just so much that's going his way. Like we talk about the Hall of Fame dad thing, but that stuff really matters. Like knowing already how the league works and how to carry yourself. And I mean, he's not even he hasn't even done like any testing, because he's like, I'm just going to practice receiver, you know, like I'm not going to do this like underwear Olympics thing. Like he's like one of the best, because I think even Chase, who we all knew was going to go in the top 5 or so, like he didn't play football that last year. So there had to at least be like something in the back of your mind that would say like, there is some chance that this like doesn't work. And for Harrison, I don't really feel that way. For Neighbors, like I think that there's more outs to him not being as good. Like I would look at him as more of like your traditional top receiver. Obviously he's an excellent prospect as well, But I think if we're just looking like totality of the range of outcomes, like I think Harrison's are better.
Yeah, and this is probably maybe more important for like redraft best ball that's going on pre NFL draft than it is for dynasty, because dynasty, we really want to be focused on the player talent, especially at wide receiver, not as much landing spot. With that said, the landing spots options are pretty good for these guys. What you look most likely is going to happen, like they're probably going to enter an offense where there's a lot of targets available and the offense is at least like decent quarterback play. If you get with the Cardinals at 4 or the Chargers at 5, the Giants at 6, a little bit shakier in terms of quarterback play. I do think like Dable is a good offensive mind though, and you are walking into a lot of targets. So that type of stuff is also good for them. And I do think like the Harrison Jr. versus Caleb, I've kind of capitulated to Caleb 101 there. I'm going to take him 101 in my drafts, but at 103, I think it's a similar dynamic to another tier down, which is like Drake May versus Malik Neighbors. And that one, I think I'm a little bit on the side of Malik Neighbors right now. I know you have Drake May currently ranked slightly ahead. Obviously, we're nitpicking a little bit here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, like I just don't feel quite as solid about Neighbors as I do about Harrison. Like they're like close without being close, if that makes sense. Like clearly these are two excellent prospects, but I just feel like way, way better about Harrison, like I said. And then at quarterback, like May just has so many characteristics of guys who hit at like a really high level. Like I was looking at some of the stuff regarding like depth of target or ADOT and attempts. Like there's just not a lot of guys who have like 1,000 attempts, 1,000 dropbacks in college and have an ADOT over 9.5, and they're almost all good players. So, and May can run. So I feel actually really good about him from a fantasy perspective. And I just think that like if I'm looking quarterback versus receiver, like I'm kind of just making the same decision that I was in the first iteration of this. It's just a tier down.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I'll have the article that I'm referencing out on Established to Run. By the time you listen to this podcast or watch on YouTube, it should be up. You can check it out. It's kind of interesting if you look at, again, the past 4 rookie drafts, break it down by position, also by ADP. You see like how valuable the early firsts are relative to middle firsts. This year, I'd even extend like the early first definition out to maybe like 107 with what we're looking at. It's a really fun draft. So, Amico, any closing thoughts on QB versus wide receiver, these guys in particular up top?
I mean, I think that like, I guess I'll just say I think it's close enough where like your team need has to matter. Like there are definitely some teams that have really good quarterback situations and don't necessarily have to take. I mean, I think if you're not going to take Caleb, your best move is probably just to trade down. But in this like, especially like this May Neighbors discussion, like if you're square at quarterback, like just take Neighbors, like that's fine. Like I think that this class is so good up top and it's such a great year for multiple picks that where you are at as a roster really matters a lot. There's so many years where I feel like it's just like the tiers are so clear where you're like, just take the best guy and figure it out later. And this is definitely a year where you can look a little bit closer at your team to make that decision.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If you can trade down to 102, it's always sometimes hard to make that move, but I'm with you. There's value in that. But yeah, if you are like me, what prompted the question for me at the 101 and more of like a rebuild, and you don't have that quarterback situation figured out, I'm going to take Caleb. Again, I think even if I don't want to stick with Caleb in a year, I think the trade outs are going to be just astronomical for a quarterback at some point. That it's going to be worth it, making him the better pick. And it can be difficult to acquire a quarterback when it becomes time to compete. That's the other wrinkle. So I guess the biggest concern is if a quarterback's truly 50-50 to hit, do you want in a rebuild where you're not ready to compete yet take a 50-50 proposition instead of maybe like an 80-20 proposition on Harrison. But everything we've gone over in this podcast, I think leans towards, you still, because of the floor for a year or two, even 3 years, and then the upside if it hits, you actually do want to take that bet. That 50-50 real life boom bust for a quarterback doesn't really apply to dynasty football, at least in the first 1 to 2 year window.
Yeah, and the other thing with that too, when you talked about like acquiring a player when you're ready to compete, like quarterbacks are pushed up so much that it's like when you go to do that, you're not going to get someone that's really good. Like you're going to get someone that's playable, and you're going to have to kind of live with it. Whereas at receiver, like this past season, like guys like Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupp, like those guys have been devalued a lot, even though maybe like on a single year basis they could still produce. So like if you're trying to make a run and you're trying to acquire a guy at a singular position, it's way easier, I think, to do that at receiver than it is at quarterback.
All right, you can follow all of Amico's dynasty rankings and content over on Establish the Run. I know he's grinding NFL draft stuff. If you follow his Substack, he just released his round 1 mock draft and is helping us release some NFL draft prop picks. And as I noted, you can check out the article I have on dynasty rookie picks and how they've aged in terms of trade value over the last 4 years on Establish to Run. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Looking forward to getting back into a little bit of a rhythm here with some more dynasty focused episodes over the next month or so.